All right, looks like we're at time, so let's go ahead and get started. My name is Janae, and I want to welcome you to the Around the Valuation World for October 21st, 2024. Before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to obtain CP credit, you must answer all the poll questions that pop up on your screen during today's webinar. If you have an AVW subscription, you'll receive the CP credit through your nacv.com portal within 7 to 10 business days. If you don't have a subscription, you wish to earn CPE for these for watching the webcast, there is a link in our materials that will direct you on how to obtain that CPE subscription. With AVW, we try to cover all the hot topics in the industry. However, with just a limited 2 hours, we're unable to cover all the topics that come up. So we do have links to other resources where you can stay abreast on all the current events and hot topics in the industry. And with that, today we have Alina Rivera joining us, and I'm going to turn the time over to her, and she'll get this started for today.
Thank you, Shanda, and welcome everyone to our October show. Today we are going to have Michael Gregory. He's doing the industry headlines as every month. So it's great to be in update with all the topics related to what we do. And after that, we have Janae and Simon, and they're going to be discussing global economic. And I love them all the time because, you know, their conversation are just so in depth that I love that topic. And then we have Stephen White and Greg Caruso. They are going to be talking about business valuation and fairness opinion in our industry and expert insight session. After that, we're going to have one of the sessions that everyone loves, and it's going to be our conversation with our judges. It's going to be Janae with them discussing financial intermediation when it all goes wrong. And after that, we're going to have Michael Mulder, as every month. He's going to be discussing valuation verdicts. So it's going to be Downing versus Shoreside Petroleum Inc. this month. And then at the end, we're going to have Austin McNair and Will Casserly, and they are going to be talking about overcoming digital visibility challenges. So now let's start with Mike Gregory. Hi.
Hi. I'm just going to bring up my screen here. And I'm on here each month. Those of you who haven't seen me before, I'm a negotiation and valuation specialist in mediation. And it's my pleasure to be with you here again today. We're going to cover 6 different topics. And the first one, understanding the role of memory in interviews undertaken by auditors, pitfalls and solutions. That may be something you don't normally think about, but this comes from the Journal of Forensic and Investigative Accounting. And I think you're going to find the brief insights I'm giving you interesting, and I'm going to suggest you might want to read this article. Then using expert witnesses in arbitration proceedings. Updates on 2 closed-end fund reports are available, and actually this involves both discount for lack of control and discount for lack of marketability. Most BV firms worry about ongoing staff shortages, new valuation credential for healthcare valuation, and then new edition of Pratt Stats BV Handbook for Lawyers. So let's go over our main objectives for today. We're going to evaluate memory and bias in the valuation of businesses. And I've made presentations in the course of the last 1.5 years on bias in mediation, and bias in valuations. That was at the ASA conference. And it's a very interesting topic that's gotten a lot of interest here in the last, I'd say 1.5 to 2 years. Identify key aspects of expert witnesses in arbitration. Choose 2 new sources on closed-end funds. Evaluate how your firm compares with staff shortages, because you're not alone. Consider the new credential and healthcare valuations, and this was new to me. I'm looking forward to sharing that with you. And consider the new Pratt's BV Handbook for Lawyers, and think about that for yourself, and think about it for recommending for attorneys that you work with to explain what it is that we do. So the first article, understanding the role of memory in interviews undertaken by auditors, pitfalls, and solutions. These are just very major highlights. There's a lot more to this article than this, and I'd encourage you that if you do interviews of others, and you're doing this for your valuations, you're doing this, you're involved with litigation, I'd really suggest you read this article. First thing you want to do is understand the motivation of the interviewee. So where are they coming from? Why do they have the bias and position they do? How helpful or unhelpful might they be? And then what actually happens in the brain with memory? How does that work? What are the different parts of the brain that are involved with this? And how do our biases enter into our decision-making on what we remember? Then techniques for mitigating the effects of memory failings. So knowing that our memories aren't perfect, and this has been proven many times now that we have DNA, that people think they saw things and they didn't quite get that right. There are techniques for mitigating that on the kind of questions you might want to ask to help them jar other elements in their memories, which may be different from their bias. And then prompting for more details, so going deeper, asking more open-based, more detail-oriented questions, helping with the retrieval of clues. So there are clues in our brains that can actually help us open up and see things that maybe we don't remember, but once we have the reminder, we do. And then probing questions and the art of questioning. That's a beautiful area of saying what you heard them say, paraphrasing, asking opening questions, summarizing what they've said, and then what are other questions you might want to ask going further with that. And then finally, there are memory exercises for helping you actually expand and improve upon your own memory. So interesting article, thought you might enjoy that. Using expert witnesses in arbitration proceedings. This is from an Expert Pages blog. Well, benefits. Arbitration is confidential. It's usually cheaper if you can arbitrate the case rather than going to court, and it's usually faster. Decisions can come out much quicker. If you go to U.S. tax court, those can go 6 months to 6 years in terms of on the way extended, but it's usually about a 2-year time frame. And in arbitration, the decision comes out relatively quickly. Expert witness discovery and disclosure in arbitration are handled by the arbitrator. So they can say, you need to provide that. And whatever that is, you need to provide it. So they control discovery and disclosure. They also determine who is admitted as an expert in arbitration and your role in that arbitration. And there are advantages of experts in arbitration. So if you're an expert, it can be very pointed kind of discussion type presentation. You don't have to go through the same type of legal administrative components that you would if you were going to court. Then updates on 2 closed-end fund reports are available. The 2 closed-end funds are both from Partnership Profiles. This is James Park and Bruce Johnson. They update this periodically, I think just about annually. But one deals with closed-end fund report on fixed income securities, and the other one deals with stocks and equity investments. They have very similar elements in both, and they refer to this as not just for DLOCs, but it's the DLOC and the DLOM, and it's looking at flips and LLCs, family limited partnerships, and LLCs, and then other elements as well. And looking at the BV industry, this is from a survey that was done by BV Resources. 80% of firms are concerned about BV staff and shortages, so that's widespread across the whole industry. And 56% say they're actually short-staffed right now. And of that 56% that say they're short-staffed, 80% said they're short-staffed with junior people, and 60% say short-staffed with senior people. And one of the things that has come out of this is there's a broader perspective of who you might want to bring on board today as a junior staffer compared to what that definition may have been 5 or 10 years ago. They said that 57% see an increased volume of demand for their services, so there's a greater demand for our work with BV. And 29% said they've had to increase compensation and benefits because, as you know, the old economics theory with supply and demand, if we don't have enough supply and demand is there, correspondingly, the price goes up. And then 14% said they're experiencing staff retirement. So there's the older group, the baby boomers that are saying, you know, I think I'm going to go on to something else. So with the baby boomers moving on, that's causing to have additional openings beyond what we might have seen historically as those folks retire. Whoops. Then there's a new valuation credential for healthcare compensation. This was new to me. I think this is very cool. If you're involved with healthcare, this is offered by the American Association of Provider Compensation Professionals, AAPCP. So you might right now have a valuation credential for valuation. If you're in the healthcare arena, you might want to explore this too. This particular credential is from a not-for-profit group. So they're looking to say, we want to put certain information out there for people who are doing valuations in healthcare and compensation. And it's expected as time goes on, there's going to be increased scrutiny by regulators. I certainly would think that's probably true with ESOP, and it's certainly true with certain other regulatory agencies as well, looking at healthcare. And then need to address fair market standards in the industry. So It's taking a look at this from the standpoint of what do we think as an organization of this not-for-profit group as minimum requirements. And if you want to work in this area, I'd suggest you take a good hard look at this organization. And then probably the most important or biggest item that's come out in the near term has been this Lawyer's Business Valuation Handbook. It's a new handbook that's come out. It's the 3rd edition. It's the Shannon Pratt's The Lawyer's Business Valuation Handbook, Understanding Financial Statements, Appraisal Reports, and Expert Testimony. This comes out from Shannon P. Pratt and the ASA Educational Foundation. You buy the book through the American Bar Association. Now, this book has inside it a checklist on chapter 34 of all the things that should be in the BV report. And in that checklist, it sends you to other chapters in the book that describe areas of expertise. So my perspective is this has a value on a couple different levels. It has a value for you. I think you should have a copy of this because it summarizes everything related to business valuation, up-to-date information, top authors in their fields, and gives you information that you should know. And then secondly, I think it's something that you would want to tell your clients. I have several clients I'm working with right now that are attorneys. And when this book, and it relates to business valuation, I do a fair amount of mediation between business to business, business to government, and within businesses. And with those attorneys, I sent all of them a link to this new book. And I said, if you don't have this for your library, you'd like to have this for your library. And I look at it as beneficial for you because sometimes we get asked questions by attorneys and we can spend a lot of time talking about that. And it can save you time because you can say, well, you've got that Lawyer's Business Valuation Handbook and chapter whatever goes into some depth, but I can tell you the 5-minute answer. But to get the 1-hour answer or the answer you're really looking for, you can skim that in 15 minutes. Or you can read that in an hour or so, and you can be right up to date with whatever it is that you want to know. So it's a way of giving something to someone else that can really help them if they're involved in business valuation and their attorneys. So tell your attorney and clients that you would like to provide this to them. They can order this book, and it'll really help them out. The book was edited by Roger Grabowski and Elena Nicolita. And note the checklist. I commented chapter 34 for reviewing a BV report. Is telling these attorneys what they should be reviewing on your work and takes you to specific chapters in more detail. And that's telling you too, these are the things I want to make sure I have in there because attorneys are expecting to see those. And there's the cost. The lower cost is if you're a member of the American Bar Association, and the higher cost is if you're not a member of the American Bar Association. Then in order to find this, here are some links. Here's the link to the closed-end fund report for fixed income securities. And then second one, that's the link for the closed-end fund report for stocks and equity investments. And I know from history that the partnership profiles presented by James Park and Bruce Johnson is always an excellent book. So it's important you get the most recent edition with that. Then here's the Association of the American Association of Provider Compensation Professionals. And if you're working in the healthcare industry, I'd strongly encourage you to check that out. And finally, there's the link for Shannon Pratt's book on BV Handbook for BV Professionals. I encourage you to check that out and also make a recommendation to the attorneys you're working with that maybe they would want to get a copy of this too for their library. Then each month, this is who I am. I'm Michael Gregory. There's my phone number. There's my email if you have any thoughts, comments, concerns. If I can help you with something, the call is always free. Be sure to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to help you. And with that, I'm going to toss this back to you, Elena.
Thank you, Mike. And everyone, if you need him, just make sure to reach out to him. He's always available to help. And we have our first polling question right now. So make sure to respond to that sometimes people are asking about the polling question. So this is the first one. And now we have Janae. She is with us and she's going to be interviewing. She's going to be, oh, no. Yeah. And she's going to be talking with Simon. They're going to be talking about economics. So Janae.
Great. Thanks so much. Scared me a little bit, but
I was scared too. I'm like, oops. Go ahead.
Great. Thanks so much. All right, we have Simon with us again, and I apologize. I every once in a while don't have my slides queued up where I thought I did when I started them. Sorry. So Simon has been with us before. Simon has such excellent knowledge and such a great way of summarizing things for us, the global macro picture, and kind of drilling that down to valuation. So I will let you all read his bio. He is extremely technically knowledgeable and gifted, and I feel very fortunate to be able to interview you this morning, Simon. So because I know that there's so much to say, I want to just jump right into it. How are you, what are you seeing in the global macroeconomic picture?
Well, look, first of all, it's not nice to be here again, and really nice to be able to talk to everyone and also hopefully get some thoughts from people listening in about how they're seeing the business environment and what that's likely to mean for valuation. So I always like to hear some feedback. But Janie, going back to your question, look, we talked some months back, and I don't think my perspective, has changed very much since then. In a way, it's strange because there's been a lot of, a lot of talk, a lot of water under the bridge. But I think if you look at the sort of headline sort of global macro numbers, I don't think the picture has, really moved on a great deal. It's, at an aggregate level, it's probably a little bit below par. People are, and you can see that in some of the conversations. But, recurring stories of recession keep coming up, but I'm not sure. Certainly, in key parts of the world, I'm not sure I really see it. There are some countries in Europe where we, may be flirting with it, but overall, I think it's more of the same, actually. I would point to a couple of, recent indicators that almost verify that. One of the ones I watch quite carefully is from Oxford Economics. It's a global economics consultancy. And they pull together what they call as a business sentiment index. I'm sure many people on this call look at other indicators that are very similar, where you're just getting some sort of gut feel from people working in different industries. And I would find that quite helpful. They're saying that, perhaps their latest readings are a little less upbeat than previously. But, actually, they're sort of a long way from signaling a material downturn. So confidence, it's not going gangbusters, if you want to put it that way. But on the other hand, it's also not that, it's certainly not taking a turn for the worse materially. And the other thing I look at, I mean, obviously, you look broker research, investment bank research is, sort of I think you've got to view it in a way that, depending on your own predilections for this stuff, we know that some of it may not necessarily always be quite, what we want of it. But, I looked at the latest stuff from Goldman Sachs is interesting. And they've just done a probability assessment of a recession for next year. They're giving it a 15% chance, which is actually pretty much in line with what the unconditional long-term average probability of a recession is. So they're not really signaling we are at high risk at this moment. Actually, they're suggesting we're at relatively low risk.
Very interesting. Yeah, I've been watching some of the IMF releases, and it just seems kind of more the same, not willing to be very optimistic, but also not the sky is falling yet.
Yeah, well, I think that's where the IMF has been pretty much there for a while now, and understandably, clearly it's reflecting, a lot of the sort of headline macro material it's seeing. And I think, it's, October report in the process of being released is reflecting that same sort of mood music.
Mm-hmm. So what about for the emerging world? Are you seeing anything different there?
Well, I mean, first of all, I would say in terms of the big picture, advanced economies, the US, I mean, many people on this call who are based in the US, and I know not everyone is, but those who are based in the US may not always feel that the economy's, doing everything they want. But actually, the numbers suggest that the US is actually one of the better performers out there. And that may be a relatively low bar looking
That's
at
still the worst.
somebody, but yeah, it's still a good place to be doing business, all said and done. And I think, if one were to look at Europe, and Europe always is a bit of a curate's egg, there's good and bad, but there's a distinct difference between the tone of the debate in Europe and certainly in North America and the US in particular. And Japan itself has its ongoing issues in terms of advanced economies. If you look at the emerging world, again, very mixed picture. And I suppose I'm still echoing the messages I was giving earlier this year, where there doesn't seem to be any relief for those operating in the Chinese orbit. And, I don't know how how relevant that is in terms of actual businesses and business valuation. But you're certainly looking at the numbers coming out of China. I mean, 5% growth was the government's target. It looks likely it's going to miss it. We've had another stimulus package. It probably isn't big enough to move the dial materially. And I think it's fair to say that, the focus of the People's Bank very much on easing monetary policy, but monetary policy isn't really the problem, and it's not going to be the solution. So, there was a bit of optimism with that latest round of stimulus. If you watch, and I happen to have a Chinese fund in my portfolio, and I saw it shoot up quite dramatically, but it's given up a lot of those gains in the last few weeks. So I think there's still big question marks over where the Chinese economy is going. If I was to look at the other big Asian economy, India, the picture is, I think, actually very different. The numbers still say 7% growth. And, there was a bit of an indecisive outcome to the election earlier this year. Some people worried about political paralysis. It doesn't seem to be an issue. The government seems to be functioning pretty well, and the economy's sort of delivering. So the emerging market story, and I'm only just touching on this because of time, but I think it's very much, as was in many respects, and clearly very divergent trends depending on where you're operating, what you're looking at.
Yeah, not to derail us, but did you see Putin's comments about the BRICS growth? And
I didn't. I might have missed that one.
Putin was talking about how BRICS was going to bring most or all of the economic growth coming. And I mean, it was not necessarily surprising given, like 7%, I think you mentioned in India, and China's still growing close, about 4%. So there's a lot of growth there, but it was just, he was.
Oh, well, I think there's a lot of, it's easy to brag when your base is quite low, of course. I mean, that's the difficulty that a lot of advanced economies have, that their base is quite high. And we know that 5% or less than 5% in China is problematic given some of the structural changes that are taking place there. Specifically about Russia, of course, they have been a beneficiary of some of the commodity trends that we've seen in recent years. But I don't think the fault lines in the economy can fundamentally be disguised by that. So I'm sure the BRICS will make a contribution to growth. Whether they're going to be the only source of growth and whether they're going to be growing enough to deal with some of the challenges that they face is questionable.
Mm-hmm. So along those lines, the fault lines, what can you say about key risks going forward?
Well, I think one's always got to be mindful of these risks. And I noticed a question came in, which actually is going to touch on one of my risks, but I will go through them in the sort of way I was thinking. And first of all, it's hard to escape that we've got sort of a lot of sort of turmoil in parts of the world. I mean, obviously, Middle East is probably, the most significant one at the moment, but Ukraine is still rumbling on. Both obviously do add to geopolitical concerns, and we talked about the BRICS and we talked about Putin, and this is an ongoing issue. But also, I suppose the potential ramifications around oil prices from the Middle East is something that lingers in the background. I think so far we've all seen, but there hasn't been a sustained uplift. One would, I think, be reluctant to come to the conclusion that there won't be. We don't know how this war is going to develop. And I think that clearly, when you talk about Middle East wars, there's always a risk. So I think one's got to keep a mind on that. The second issue I really want to address, and I think it is one that actually the question mentioned here, is, the risk of policy errors. Look, these always need to be borne in mind. Central banks are, in an invidious position generally. They're working on the basis of partial information, and they're always likely to be surprised as new insights come to life. And they're obviously at the moment in particular trying to tread what is a pretty fine line between trying to ensure that any downturn in activity doesn't become too embedded, but on the other hand, also, not wanting to reignite inflation. And I will cut, we can see pretty easily why inflation might be reignited. And I think in the earlier presentation, there was a mention about, lack of, of skill shortages. I think it was mentioned. But when I look around the world, and I do that looking with my real estate hat on and with my construction hat on, I'm constantly being told about, issues about recruitment. So, one can see where, the inflation risk lies. And so just going back to the question that was actually raised, there has been some discussion over the past week or two about whether the Fed would have actually delivered the half-point cut had it known that the September jobs report in the US would be quite so solid. So, it is a fine line. Now, the question was, do I think they made a mistake? Well, look, I suspect that if they'd have seen such a solid report, they'd have probably gone quarter. I think that they do want to begin to lower rates somewhat. And I think they are mindful that these are, the way the economy is operating on a fine balance at the moment. It's doing okay, but, there are risks around the momentum. And they do want to begin to adjust monetary policy. But I would say that it's easy with the benefit of hindsight, rear view mirrors and the rest of it. Probably they would have been a bit more cautious than going for the half point. That doesn't negate the prospect of more quarter point cuts over the course of the next 12 months. And I will come back to that in a bit. But just thinking about other areas of risk, I think fiscal policy is one, simply because of what it means for bond markets. Can all these major economies around the world and some of the smaller ones, continue to sell the quantities of bonds that they need to fund their sort of their borrowing gaps? And you mentioned the IMF earlier. Last week, it put out its fiscal monitor. And I think it talked about, in aggregate, public sector debt rising, by the end of this decade, I think it was, to 100% of GDP. I mean, these are big numbers. And the problem is they have to be financed. And as we all know, there's a cost on financing, which actually eats up some of your ability to spend on what we might think are more worthy areas of expenditure, depending on the country one's in and the issues that are relevant. I think on top of that, we're all aware that there are some really structural long-term factors or medium-term factors that are going to be exerting upward pressure on public borrowing. We know, for example, that populations in the West are aging in general. We know that security concerns are building and the pressure is to spend more money on defense. There is pressure around green transitions, and there's also longer term sort of development challenges, particularly if one looks at some of those emerging markets, which won't come cheap, which need support. So, this is the risk here is that, governments talk a good story, but don't actually put in place credible fiscal strategies. And, given, what's going on in terms of the political dimension, I think there's a risk that, we're going to see those numbers on borrowing continue to creep up, which will present challenges. Now, it's not binary, and there's not a point where bond markets take fright and the whole thing begins to turn round. But, having these sorts of high levels of borrowing means that, if there is some other risk that emerges, the whole environment becomes that much more vulnerable. So that's something we've got to watch for. And I think the final one I wanted to mention was really around, just barriers to trade flows. I think I've mentioned that in the past. I don't think we can escape that. I mean, some of the responses to tariffs are totally understandable. Some of the responses in terms of implementing tariffs are understandable. I mean, free trade's a nice term, but how free is it? So I think it's understandable that people look at who's gaining from this. But I think the risk of what we're seeing around the globe and the risk of it escalating does cause us to think about the risks here. And for the record, Morgan Stanley just put out a note about this. They suggested that if all the tariffs currently under discussion were imposed, it could boost inflation globally by about 1% and drag growth by about 1.5 percentage points. I mean, these are actually in context quite reasonably significant numbers. So something to bear in mind there.
Great. Simon, we've got about 5 minutes left. So with the remaining 5 minutes, I think it might be helpful to maybe just touch on interest rates and then maybe looking at corporate profitability and cash flows, the implications of everything that you've talked about for us in valuations in terms of the profitability and cash flows for companies.
Yeah, look, I still see rates coming down. I mean, even in the US, where the economy is growing more robustly, I think the case for it in Europe is particularly is stronger still. And we know that policy is being eased in some emerging markets already. China, Brazil amongst them. India probably will start to see rates come down. But thinking about the major economies, there is scope for rates to come down, I think, because I don't believe inflation is going to take off again. I think inflation over time will settle down. There are risks, as I say, partly linked to tight labor markets. I mean, one of the things I look at, though, is thinking about the Fed. And I talk about the Fed partly because, effectively, it's setting the tone for other central banks. It doesn't drive other central banks, but it does set the framework. And, it was interesting looking at the dot plot after the last meeting. Many of us do look at the dot plot. So that's pretty much where the policymakers think rates are going to go. And the longer term view that they express is an interesting one because it gives you a more of an anchor for what is the neutral, equilibrium rate of interest. For the record, and many of you probably saw the discussion at the time because it was quite widely quoted, the range was 2 to 4%. So it was a pretty big range looking out over, say, 3-4 years. And I think that helps to understand some of the challenges around, what if this was about as wide as that divergence has been. It tells you that the policymakers themselves don't have conviction, one, where interest rates are going to settle at a neutral basis, but also perhaps are mindful of the risks. But I think it's more when you talk about the longer term, what is the neutral rate? So I do think rates are going to come down. If I was to say in the US what the neutral rate is, and doesn't mean we're necessarily going to get there, but I would say 3 to 3.5 would be, a reasonable target to look at. And you would need significantly softer economic activity to go much beyond that. For the Europe, it's probably a bit lower in truth. Now, just thinking and mindful of the time, so I am rushing through some of my thoughts here, but what about corporate profitability? And on the face of it, you think margins have done pretty well, and you look at stock markets around the world, they're holding up. If that's a measure of valuation, it looks pretty rich, but it still seems to be reasonably well underpinned, even with interest rates where they are. Growth's not eye-catching. I know, or economic growth isn't, but somehow right margins have generally been on a rising trend in the face of what are tight labor markets and wage growth. I am a bit concerned about whether this can be sustained. There's a lot of pressure, a lot of focus on, inevitably on living standards. This is a global problem. People feel that they've lost out post-COVID. And, public services feel drained, particularly in Europe. And if you look at the electoral, dynamics, and particularly, we've had a lot of elections in Europe recently, they're increasingly reflecting this dissatisfaction. So, I think that increasingly there is going to be pressure on governments to really think about how they can address these issues. And while, we know that businesses aren't cash cows, they may be seen as a source around which, more can be extracted in order to help to address some of these challenges. So I think that the overall picture for corporate profitability is still pretty good. And I think that will be reflected in cash flows. But, there are some risks there. And I think they're partly linked to the political environment, as well as just thinking about sort of the challenges around sustaining economic activity going forward.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, that was impressive timing, Simon. So
Hang on, is it? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
Yeah, look, I'm sorry, I didn't get to all the questions, but actually what I'm happy to do is look at them later and send through some responses so they can be passed on.
Yeah, that's great. I saw some interesting,
Yeah.
at least one interesting question to
Yeah.
address after, and maybe another segment later on.
Yeah.
So thank you so
Okay.
much, Simon.
Okay, nice to
Bye.
speak to you, and thank you very much.
Likewise. Back to you, Lena.
Great. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Janae. This is Janae with NACBA. Before we move on to the next one, we just have a quick little update. Let me just change this real quick. All right, we do have our conference coming up in December 12th to the 13th. There are links in your material if you are interested in joining us. And right now, we just have a quick little message from two of our presenters.
Hi, I'm Carla Nunes.
And I'm Jim Harrington.
And we're both from Kroll. We're really looking forward to going to the upcoming 2024 Super Conference that the NACBA is organizing in Las Vegas. Our session is called Global Economic Update, Impact on Cost of Capital and Valuations. And this is a year where we have US presidential elections, as well as the Federal Reserve Bank has started cutting interest rates. So there's a lot to unpack, and that will actually impact the outlook going forward for your valuations. And we will be talking about that, expectations into the future, and how have markets been performing in the current environment. Jim is actually going to give us some more details on that.
Yeah, I've got a lot of things to talk about. Current inflation is down, but why is everything still so expensive? I'll talk about the surprising results in the US and European stock markets since COVID. I'll talk about US stock market returns under each president, so you can pick out your favorite president and see how they did. And since inflation is on everybody's mind, we'll show you how presidents did after inflation took its bite out of your stock market returns. And since this is an election year, as Carla mentioned, we'll talk about how the market does in election years usually, and how it does after an election is over.
Please join us in our session in December in Vegas.
We're really looking forward to seeing you there.
That is great. So we are expecting you in Las Vegas. We are going to be there, right, Stephen? So it's a great time not only to add more knowledge and have CPEs, but also the networking. So if you go there, we're going to be there.
Yes, we will.
And Stephen, that is our next correspondent. He's going to be interviewing Caruso, and he's going to be there too with Janae also. So Stephen.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be an exciting conference this year. We haven't been in Vegas for a while, so this is going to be a great time to get back there and meet with some subject matter experts on a lot of different things. But right now, we get a chance to interview one of my favorite subject matter experts, Mr. Greg Caruso. How are you, sir?
I'm doing quite well. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great. Now, Greg, you and I have known one another for almost about 10 years, and I've learned a lot from you over those 10 years. And you chose a topic that is near and dear to me. And I feel like it should be discussed a lot in regards to business valuation and fairness opinions. So I can go through your bio. I think everybody knows who you are. Obviously, you wrote this fantastic book, The Art of Business Valuation, Articulating Value of Small Businesses. You are the former editor of this great show that we're actually on right now. You publish and quick read. You do a lot of business valuations and ESOPs, estate and gifts, SBA, and the list goes on and on. So tell us why you chose to talk about fairness opinions, and or better yet, you can start off by telling us a little bit about those who are not familiar with fairness opinion, exactly what is a fairness opinion, and then dovetail that into why you thought this would be a great time to talk about it.
Perfect. So I'm going to do just like politicians and talk about what I want, and maybe even get to your question there. Okay.
It is that time of the year, isn't it?
I didn't hear that. I heard this question. Well, I'm giving a 2 hour, maybe 2 50-minute hours, but a 2 hour presentation after this on M&A and business valuation. And, when I got presented that opportunity, of course, my initial thoughts are all the overlaps and the ways, what I've learned from having brokered for many years, which I am no longer doing, and how it applied to business valuation. But then, when I started thinking about my current practice, where I'm doing a lot more technical valuations, including, as you mentioned, ESOPs. And, anybody who's in that arena is at a minimum being asked to do fairness opinions, probably doing them. And yet, as you kind of said, I don't think we talk about them a whole lot.
No, we don't.
So, and I know, lawyers hate their version of fairness opinions and try not to ever sign them. I have a legal background, so I'm coming from particular paranoia on those points. So I thought it would be, since it is such a big part, if you're doing formal valuations of transactions, or it can become such a big part,
right?
I thought it would really make sense to cover it, so that other people aren't doing what I did the first time they got asked, which is calling about 8 friends and going, "What am I supposed to do here?" And asking.
But isn't that what we're supposed to do, right?
Do you have a sample of one so I can see what you're asking me to actually, so they could at least, do ask for a sample, see what they want for a start. I'm not suggesting you don't do that, but it'd be nice to have a framework to put it against. So that's where this came up from.
And it's interesting because of the mere fact that as we look at our association and we kind of get an idea, and you've been a part of the association longer than I have, you kind of get a gauge as far as what valuators are doing, what type of business they're doing. We do have some that are doing ESOPs, but we also have a large population that are in that M&A space. And for us not really to talk about fairness opinions and where we fit into that overall equation, I think it's telling, first of all, right? Well, to your point about some people don't like it, and maybe they don't like it because they don't really understand exactly what it is.
Yes, well, and then the other problem is often the wording you are given is beyond what it is. It is assurances. It is almost indemnification. It is, and some of it comes under the heading of this understanding of what they are, that we all hope continues to not be judicially changed. And some of it comes under, in my view, it's overreaching language, and it needs to be negotiated. Like any time somebody hands you something that may, if it's done improperly, carry a lot of liability.
Right.
And again, that's where law school ruins you for a lot of things. You focus, in law school, a contract, the difference between a contract between a businessman and a lawyer is a lawyer writes it to be broken. They write it to be broken. So that's why they're so focused on, well, if this goes wrong, what happens? And if that goes wrong, you can't run a business if that's really how you go through life thinking. At some point you're going to make it happen. So for me, I carry a little more paranoia in these than I probably should. But so far, I've always been able to negotiate something that I felt was reasonable, that was acceptable to the people.
Right.
So what fairness opinions are, let's get to that. is they are an independent analysis. And there's actually not a tremendous amount out there written, even in scholastic type writings. There's a lot of articles that say fairness opinions are really important and you should use us to write them. But in terms of actually telling you what to do, but what they really are, and you used the word or wherever this quote came from, and you provided it, and I didn't modify it. I thought it was very good, and I do appreciate your help on this topic.
No problem.
I know you do quite a few too. You use the word independent third party, which certainly we as valuators would be in most cases. Now, fairness opinions are often provided by the brokerage house doing the transaction. I'm not sure how independent Joe in the fairness opinion branch is from Melvin, who's bringing in the big money, but that is an issue that they're not always independent. Certainly we are. But the purpose of a fairness opinion is to summarize the transaction meaningfully, to provide some insight and to indicate it is in a range that is fair. Of course, fair tends not to be defined. Now, again, we can get into specific fairness opinions for specific purposes, and they do sometimes get a little beyond the general statement here, but sort of a general fairness opinion says, well, the transaction is fair, usually to the buyer, maybe to the seller. It depends who is trying to get some coverage, that they've done proper due diligence. And that's really what it's about, giving good notice as to a summary that makes sense of the transaction. Certainly for your protection, you want to talk about what you looked at, what analyses you've done, how you came to this conclusion a little bit. But it's so that the board or the trustees or whoever has to make the decision,
the fiduciary,
has some evidence that they did proper due diligence, that they thought about this. It wasn't just Joe, the president, came in and said, we're going to do this, and everybody said, how quick?
Right.
It's that you did your due diligence. That's the predominant reason. Now,
so before you go on, Greg, let's pivot there for just a moment, because the independent third party is a unique part of this, right? So everything that you just said, that's where the independent person comes in, because they're not biased in one way or the other of the actual transaction that's already taken place. So I have a two-part question for you. One, based on the things that you just said, what's the difference between a fairness opinion and a valuation, in your opinion? Your professional
fairness
judgment.
Opinion is usually for a third party.
Uh-huh.
I mean, now I may have been hired by the third party, but I may not have.
Right.
A fairness opinion again, is when you hire me to do a valuation, probably you're often management, and I'm doing it for you. If you're a trustee in a valuation situation, I'm doing it for you. But a fairness opinion in a valuation, and we can give a range, but we are giving, this is the number. In a fairness opinion, we are saying this is fair,
right?
But we're really not. We're not nailing down the number like we do in a valuation.
Right.
We're not giving final legal. We're not telling you, oh, you should. We're telling you the deal's fair. We're not telling you, oh, you should do this deal. We're not telling you this is the best deal. I wouldn't tell you that in your valuation either, having done M&A. But we're not telling you this is the best deal you might ever get.
Correct. You're not giving them the highest price or the best price or the things of that nature. You're giving them a range. And I think that's where misconception comes in. Whereas, because we are experts in what we do, And some would argue that that valuation should cover that. And that's not the same thing as a fairness opinion.
Well, again, the fairness opinion, we're looking at the terms of the transaction. My opinion of value, if fair market value, I don't get into terms.
Right.
The terms are it's going to be a very quick payment, cash on the barrelhead. Well, I've never seen a transaction for more than a deli on those terms. Or maybe a liquor store on those terms. When you get into more complex businesses, you have all kinds of terms and you have layers of financing and you have representations and warranties. And we're not saying this is the perfect deal, but we're saying the deal is fair and reasonable as it applies to that. And the number as it relates to that is fair and reasonable. But again, in many cases, not all, because you and I both do ESOP ones where we do have to say that it's adequate
Correct.
Follows adequate consideration. So there is a standard of value. But if you read most public ones, the ones that do get released, and some do, they just say it's fair to the parties involved. And one of the issues in the articles that come in a minute is, well, what does fairness mean? Fairness, it doesn't, that's not really called out anywhere like our standards of value. And yes, fairness opinions can be done by valuation experts, investment bankers, transaction advisors. In valuation experts, there's a lot more people than we get economists doing them. We
do. I've seen that. Yes.
Yeah. Well, sometimes I have to tell them, you need to go find somebody that isn't a CPA. I actually have to pay attention to the numbers. Funny how the AI CPA thinks financials count. That's happened to me on not specific. We didn't get to the fairness opinion. We'll leave it at that.
Right.
Again, commercial bankers on the larger public type deals will typically do them. Accountants can occasionally. If it's a large firm and they got a valuation person doing it, some of the things I see accountants do from small firms is kind of frightening.
Right. And that's
they really need to get their CVA if they want to. I wouldn't do their tax return. They shouldn't do my valuation.
Correct. And I see that sometimes they look at it as another revenue stream for them, but I think the water is too muddy at that point for them to be a part of that sector. But that's just my thinking. No offense to any accountants out there listening.
And if we offended you, it's okay. My email is at the end of this. You're welcome to send it to me, and we'll talk about it. I'm very human on this side of the camera.
So let's talk about some of the things that the fairness opinion is really not. What is not intended to do. You hit on a few of those things, right?
Yeah,
first one is obviously
it's not
render an
intended
opinion.
to be an insurance policy.
Absolutely.
And that's the thing that scares me the most is because, again, in the hands of sophisticated people who, are well advised, well, I would hope they or their advisors understand that. I work a lot on the fringe of smaller businesses doing these things, and I really worry about what some of those people think. And it's, they're very good at running their businesses. They didn't, they didn't go to Wharton, and, they're very good business people. But again, we're not an insurance policy. We're not, auditing the books. I do a lot of SBA business valuations to this day. And we're efficient at them. But, and I know it's for the bank. It says in it, it's for the bank and only for the bank. But I guarantee half those bankers hand them to the clients. So in my disclaimers, I have a whole paragraph on how this is not due diligence.
Right.
And, I shouldn't have to have it in there. But I am trying to make it as clear as I can to someone who bothers to at least skim the report.
Right.
That it's a valuation. It's not complete. You don't get complete due diligence for $3,000. Even on a small business.
Right. I've learned a lot from you over the years. I've also learned something from Michael Kaplan about disclaimers. They don't always protect you in court.
Nothing always works ever. That's why in my engagement, I've got about 5 levels of trying to reduce my liability.
And the one thing
I'm hoping one of them will hold if I really had a problem.
That's true. I think when it comes down to fairness opinions, and also at the end of the day, it really comes down to your fiduciary responsibilities. And far too often, that responsibility sometimes tries to get shifted over back to the advisor, whomever that person is that's putting together that fairness opinion.
Well, and that's what I was going to say, Steve, is I don't have fiduciary responsibility, and I don't intend to assume it. And the trustee whose questionnaire asked me how I assume their fiduciary responsibility probably didn't like the answer I gave them, because that's my job is to advise them to be reasonable in all of these things, to not be a shill for one side or the other. But the flip side is it doesn't mean it's the best deal. It doesn't even mean it's dead center. It means it's within that range of reasonable.
Right.
And so all this came about. We flipped to the court case that arose all this, Smith versus Van Gorkum, which in a typical case, and this sort of ties into Steve's, you can have all the disclaimers you want.
Right.
Well, in this case, they didn't have a disclaimer. The court did not find, at least in this ruling, that the board did something wrong. They didn't find technically that the value that was accepted wasn't there. What they found is that the board didn't do the due diligence to make that determination. And that in order to do that one thing they should do is get a fairness opinion in order to make that, which then immediately created the whole industry. I do believe they were already around, but it made
it brought it to the
something
forefront.
that was nice to have to almost a necessity.
Exactly. And there's some other court cases in here as well for you to go through, read over them, that built on fairness opinions, and for practitioners to just become well aware. We're big on looking at different court cases, so therefore you don't run into those potholes when you are putting together your fairness.
The big thing is be reasonable. Don't start opining on things you really don't know, because then you don't know if you're being reasonable, in my mind. And have some wording in there, where it makes it clear this is a fairness opinion to the level of reasonable. This is not the only deal or the best deal or every term is great. Be reasonable. So here's a list of things we can be asked to opine on. Some of them don't bother me at all. Some of them, it depends on the deal. Is a warrant, what happens in a lot of transactions is if the seller takes back financing, they may take it back at a much lower rate than mezzanine money. Mezzanine money's 12 or 15 to 20%, depending on the terms, and so if you're taking back 5% as the owner, they can issue you a warrant, a stock option, to maybe allow you to get up to 20% if everything goes well. That's a reasonable thing. There's always a concern. In some cases, there is a concern about overcompensation, because again, the trustee is very concerned that the ESOP is getting treated fairly. So again, a lot of it depends on, well, what are the underlying terms? If they're issuing 50% warrants for 50% of the value, that's difficult. We have a listing where we got a minute left, if I'm reading the time right. We have a
Yeah.
list of some things here that are included. You're welcome to go through them. They will also be, along with a few minutes on sample documents, probably a little less on history, of what you might put in a letter, what a typical one looks like, what a management representation letter, or at least a starting point. I certainly, if I'm giving a letter to sometimes quasi third parties, I want somebody telling me what they gave me was truthful.
Right.
These were some good links. If you're interested in this, again, most of it is from a public point of view of what serves as adequate notice. They kind of conclude that this is a imperfect methodology at best, but until somebody comes up with a better one, we should keep doing it.
That's true. Now, you mentioned at the very beginning, Greg, that you're going to be discussing more about M&A and business valuation later on today. You'll talk more, I'm assuming. You'll get into about fairness opinions a little bit more, perhaps.
We're going to get a
Those
little
can
more
jump
into
into
the
it.
couple slides at the end we skipped. We're also going to talk, a little bit about how transactions work.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to talk about valuing with a little more of an eye towards estimating a price for those situations. I may not call it that in the thing,
Right.
but that's what I'm doing. And a lot of other common situations, conflicts. Make sure you've covered yourself on those. All the things that anybody who thinks about what they're doing on both sides of that fence probably spends a good amount of time thinking about. So,
Well, that's
thank you.
fantastic. Great. Appreciate your time on this. It's always wonderful to get some intellectual capital from you.
My contact info is there. Anybody, you're always welcome to reach out. I'll always give you an opinion that's worth exactly what you paid for it. Thank you.
I'll hold on to that one. Elena, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Greg, thank you again.
Thank you all.
Hey, thanks, Stephen, and thanks, Greg. Again, as I mentioned, Greg will be presenting after this APW webcast today. There is a link for joining us today. You will receive 20% off if you use that promo code that's down below. And with that, we have another message from one of our conference presenters.
This year, we're going to have a great conference in Las Vegas, and I hope you'll be there. We're going to be talking about compensation again this year. In the past, I've presented on how to normalize owner compensation and business valuations, and I've really gone through the process from beginning to end, talking about methodologies, databases, and processes. This year will be a little bit different. I'll be sharing 25 practical tips, and actually it'll probably be more than that, more like 35. But it'll be a collection of points that I've learned, some of which I've learned the hard way, and some others I've learned from other people, and some I've learned through experimentation. But I'll be sharing various tips on how to normalize compensation and how to defend your work once you've done it. We'll talk about things like deferred compensation and guaranteed fees and S-corps and signing bonuses and what to include in the body of a report, what to include in footnotes, what to include in attachments and exhibits. And of course, we'll also touch on professional standards and how that affects compensation. But more importantly, we'll talk about whatever the attendees want to talk about. So I hope you'll attend, and I hope you'll come in with some questions that you want to ask, some recommendations and comments that you'd like to share with the rest of the group so we can all learn from each other. And if you have some war stories you'd like to share, that'd be great too, because we can learn so much from war stories. So I look forward to seeing you there.
So everyone, we have our third polling question in front of you. So make sure to you respond to that before it ends. And now we have Janae, and she's going to be interviewing our judges. Janae.
Great. Thanks, Alina. All right. We have with us Judges Yates and Platt. Judge Driscoll could not be here today, but I am excited for our conversation nonetheless. I thought it might be interesting for some of our attendees who may not do litigation, expert witness testimony, to have the other side of things when those of us that have accounting, finance, economics, or math acumen, they may be looking at other practice areas and how they may end up in the courtroom not expert witness. So looking maybe at things like fairness opinions or transactional work. So if you all have some thoughts for some of the risks or some of the things that maybe you've seen either in your courtrooms or more generally out there that could help some of our professionals, I'd love to hear it.
One of the things that I would suggest to everybody is before you go into the courtroom cold to testify, you need to get a sense of what the judge is like, and if there's a jury, what the jury's like, even though you can't just sit there through the whole trial under some judges' approaches to it. It certainly is helpful to talk to your retaining counsel and to anybody else you can about the acumen of the judge or the attention span of the jury, because as I'm sure Judge Platt will confirm, it's been my experience, the judges run the gamut. Some are terrified of math. And although I hate the phrase, they'll often say I went to law school because I was terrible at math. For somebody like me who was a math major undergrad with an MBA in accounting and finance, I'm very comfortable. And so you need to understand the level of sophistication of the trier of fact before you walk into the courtroom, because that allows you to calibrate the level of sophistication of your testimony to the understanding of the person who's going to make the decision, or the people in the case of a jury.
I would just echo that. And speaking, I hope on behalf of Judge Yates and myself, we would like to say that Judge Driscoll, were he here, would agree with everything that we are saying about everything.
Right.
And you can hold him accountable accordingly. I would certainly echo what Judge Yates said, and I would add to that the use of experts in not only evaluate the judge, and if there's a jury and there's a substantial difference, but also arbitrators and even mediators, and in the case of arbitration and mediation, find out what they're talking about. They may not be talking about what you came to prepare to talk about. And if that's one of the worst case scenarios, is walking in and start talking and answer questions. It reminds me a little bit of a presidential debate where if you don't want to answer the question, you talk about something else. Right. The problem is if your audience is a judge, he or she will thoroughly not appreciate that, and more importantly, not pay any attention to you when you do it. And so find out what is going on, which may or may not have to do with math. The math that's being talked about may also be the product. I had an opinion one time where I read about there was an economist, I think it was Coates, who said in his, and I quoted it, that if an economist doesn't like the reality that he or she is confronted with, he'll invent one of his own and testify accordingly. The best expert witness that I ever had as a practicing attorney was one who would come in, look at me as he was coming down the aisle and say, "What are the problems?" And I would say whatever they were, and he would say, "Don't ask me about that. I'll take care of it on cross." Right. That's an extremely competent expert witness. And he did. But oftentimes the rules allow the experts to be in the courtroom, even where there's a rule on witnesses. And that's really important to notice. Any lawyer who says, "Don't come because I don't want to pay you for the time," is foolish. Because that's the one way where you can be absolutely assured that you know what it is that is going on and what is being talked about, and not, you've got 30 seconds from the time you walk in the courtroom, if you haven't already been there, to figure that out. Why have to figure it out when you could have been there to find it out firsthand?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I'm glad that Judge Platt drew that distinction. There's a general rule of sequestration of witnesses, and if either lawyer asks to have all the witnesses excluded from the courtroom until they testify, the judge will almost always honor that. But a lot of judges, I'm one of them, make exceptions for expert witnesses. And as far as I'm concerned, if an expert witness wants to sit through the entire trial and have a better understanding of the factual foundation of the dispute, I'm all for that. And I suspect Judge Platt was probably like that too.
Yeah, Maryland has a rule that says that they're entitled to be there.
Yep.
So if a judge excluded the expert in violation of that rule, it would probably get to read about it from Judge Gates or somebody like him.
Right.
But in some states it is discretionary, but it's certainly not mandated anywhere that an expert cannot be there.
Yep.
And the discretion should be exercised if it's necessary. And if the rule is in place, then there is no discretion other than to do the right thing.
Have either of you had in your courtrooms an accountant, a finance professional, economist, business person that's ended up involved in a litigation? So either as a plaintiff or most likely as a defendant, where
Sure.
you're thinking, what were you thinking? How did you end up here? Why did you do that? Are there things from cases like that we could take away in our practice, maybe non-litigation, more transactional or advisory type practices?
One of the things that's always concerned me is the upswing in professional malpractice actions, particularly in commercial litigation. There's this growing tendency to think that, well, if I didn't win the case, it must be someone else's fault. And as a result of that, I've seen more, not only attorney malpractice, but also accountant malpractice. And it's a terrible spot to be in. In the course of my professional career, I only had 2 complaints against me for legal malpractice, and both of them were utter nonsense and were thrown out right out of the box. But it's not entirely uncommon for the trial judge to decide that there are questions of fact that need to be resolved. And the next thing you know, you find yourself sitting at the defense table trying to explain why you did what you did in the course of the transaction being put together and consummated, or even worse, in your capacity as an expert witness. And the best I can tell you about that, having been in that seat for only a short period of time twice, is it's beyond frustrating. And you have to overcome the initial instinct to just be angry about everything and be inclined not to want to cooperate. Because at the end of the day, for the people who are in your program and are at that level of competence, I'm confident that by the end of the process, it will be established that they did not do anything below professional norms. But unfortunately, when you're a party, you want civil litigation to move forward faster than it does.
The other, I would echo that and also enforce it. The regulatory people keep an eye on the judicial branch of government. And in Maryland, for instance, they will look at periodically at the filings. And if they see a familiar name to them, then they will look to see who filed, what's going on, and if it's a malpractice case. I've done a lot of malpractice cases, including for accountants. One of the things that ought to be really clear, and we've talked about this in other forums, is not every CPA can evaluate a business competently. Most judges think if you're a CPA, that's what you do.
Yeah.
And that includes everybody except the American College of Business Court judges, and even some of them who haven't been paying attention or sleeping through the programs may have suffered from that illusion. It's worthy of your time to make it clear in testimony, if necessary, to depositions. Otherwise, that's not the case. And here's what your qualifications are. The other thing is watch your relationship with with hiring counsel. As Judge Yates noted, there's a tendency, if you didn't win, well, it can't be my fault. So therefore, it must be either the lawyer's fault or the expert's fault or both.
Right.
And there are some lawyers who you can depend on to defend your expertise and your role, and others not. We're back to the retainer agreement, and really in poorly drafted dispute resolution clauses in some of these contracts that need more attention than they're getting.
Okay. So on some of these malpractice suits that you're talking about, maybe particularly with accountants and those types, how often, a rough estimate, how often would you say that when those are valid suits and they're not, frivolous, how often is it a case where someone was maybe performing outside of their wheelhouse or their competencies?
I'm pleased to say that in my experience, and I ran a business docket for 10 years, I never had an accountant who was ultimately held responsible for actionable professional negligence. I have had it happen with attorneys a couple of times, and I've seen huge verdicts in a couple of those cases. But I think that triers of fact, whether they be the business court judges or general jurisdiction judges or juries, tend to see expert witnesses like accountants as one step removed from whatever the problem may have been. And at least in my experience, many of those claims can be cleaned up before we even get to trial. I've granted summary disposition, what you would call in the federal system summary judgment, every single time I've seen one of them.
I would add that many times, my experience is say, although same thing with attorneys, I've seen a couple of cases where that was clearly, unfortunately, had happened in the case. But as an expert, do the same thing lawyers should do, and even judges and arbitrators and mediators, do a conflicts check and do a very thorough conflict check.
Yep, agreed.
Because when all else fails, and the testimony, there was nothing wrong with the research, the testimony, the whatever, then that doesn't mean they're going to give up. That's when they start looking to see what your history is. And you've got to have a system, which is amazing to me that more lawyers don't have this, but I would go for experts as well. Do that conflicts check, make sure that that's going to be like the last resort. If I can't find anything wrong with the testimony or the level of confidence or the qualifications, I'm going to conflicts checks. And the conflicts check is your firm, if you have other principals, everybody. And if there's anything to grab onto, because at that point whoever is complaining is desperate, they will grab onto it.
Yeah, and let me add to that, because I think Judge Platt's exactly right. You never have anything to be concerned about as far as professional liability if you give an accurate and honest answer to a question. It may be the case that sometimes in cross-examination, or sometimes when you get a question from the bench, or even if you get a question from the jury, you'll have to give an answer that harms the position of the client who hired retaining counsel, who hired you. But that is in no way professional malpractice. Your job is not to win the case for a client. Your job is to give the best possible professional responses you can give. And no court will ever hold you responsible for professional malpractice if that's what you do.
Great. So I'm hearing low-hanging fruit for us to consider is conflicts, which is kind of resonates with what Greg, Stephen were saying in the last segment. As far as, having any kind of fiduciary duty. Now, I can't see a scenario for just as an expert witness where we would have a fiduciary duty, but just, if I'm looking at other ways, as we come into contact with business owners, their business owners will say, hey, you kind of understand these concepts. Can you help me with this? And it's outside of maybe that expert witness realm. Are there ever issues that you see with people like what I do running into issues on fiduciary duty and kind of those things being placed on them? They talked about in the fairness opinions, how sometimes the actual board who has a fiduciary duty tries to transfer those duties or that exposure to the evaluator. Have you seen any issues like that? And do you have any thoughts for protecting ourselves from that perception?
The only way that could happen is if it's not clear who hired you. And the way that wouldn't be clear is if you have a lawyer who has in his or her own conflicts. In other words, I've had attorneys, in these 50-50 LLCs and corporations where they started off representing everybody. And then and somebody agreed to have one of the 50% owners become the president. And then the president then said to counsel, who is theoretically representing the company, do something. And the something turned out to be to screw the other side, the other 50% owner. In the meantime, and the owner says, well, I thought you represented both of us. And then you get hired to do what? To offer an opinion, and you get accused of violating fiduciary duty. We don't have one. But that's not what gets brought. That's not how it's brought forward.
Right. And I can tell you, in my experience, I've never seen an accountant or evaluator get into this sort of trouble. But back when I was doing high-priced white-collar defense, I represented 2 doctors who were actually charged with perjury for offering expert opinions, one for lying about his credentials, and the other for taking diametrically opposed positions depending on what the client's interest was. So if I can give you one piece of good advice, every time you testify, try to get and keep a copy of the transcript of your testimony, both in deposition and at trial. You want to make sure that you don't have those glaring inconsistencies. The cases where I got involved were cases where the government was actually a party in the underlying case. So they were much more aware of the acute problems with the perjury than they otherwise would have been. So ordinarily they wouldn't be fishing around, but boy, that's an enormous problem when that happens. So keep a compendium of all of the times you've testified and what you said.
Do you have recommendations on how to go about obtaining that? Where's the right place to make the request? How long do you have to make that kind of request?
Well, typically somebody will order the transcript if there's an appeal, or even during the course of the trial. It's not uncommon for lawyers to want daily copy of transcripts. But even if nobody ever orders it, if you want to, you can order it. You'll have to pay for it, but transcripts aren't too terribly expensive. So in the first instance, don't pay for it. There's got to be somebody out there who ordered it. But if nobody ordered it, you have the ability to order it yourself. Depositions are always transcribed. I know of virtually no instance where nobody orders a transcript of a deposition.
Seems fairly pointless.
Yeah, well, I mean, everybody wants to have it for trial in case you have to cross-examine. So the lawyers doing the prep always work off the depositions.
Yeah. Did you have anything to add on that, Dutch Platt?
None.
Great. Well, so that's very interesting in a way to protect yourself, because we do talk in expert witness testimony just about being consistent and not having opinions that are, when you're working for one side, they tend to say one thing, and when you're working for the other side, you tend to say something else. So
whether you get
I represented a doctor who wrote a book about how doctors should testify.
Yeah.
And cross-examination was always, doctor, you were asked this following question on direct examination and you answered the following way. Is that because it was your answer under oath and was therefore true? Or was it also because on page 56 of your book, it says if you ask the question, answer this way? He had a great comeback. His answer was both.
Absolutely. Okay, so if you have any other thoughts or ideas in like curing some of the risks, I guess I'm kind of like Greg Caruso, who was presenting earlier and said he always has this anxiety or apprehension of what could come back and bite us, whether we're providing expert witness testimony or whether we get called in as a party to a suit. So any last minute thoughts on easy cures, low hanging fruit for us to watch out for?
Just be as honest and straightforward as you can. You never get in trouble that way.
And if you need a character witness on your integrity as an expert, you call Michael Cap.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Was he a witness that you were talking about earlier that could just handle it on cross-examination? Because Michael is exactly who I thought of when you said that. Judges, helpful as always. I know it was kind of a different spin on what we usually talk about. And next time I think we'll kind of be back on the expert witness track, but I appreciate you giving us some insights into different areas of the courtroom that we may find ourselves in.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thanks, you too. Michael, has there ever been a service offering that you have considered, whether from a desire to help someone or the allure of, stellar revenues or margins, just a new revenue line that you maybe had considered a high risk service offering?
I have a two-pronged answer to that. Number one, I believe that we bring our own risk on, we as experts, in making decisions that we shouldn't be making. And there are times that we can expect that we can bring on to offer a service to a client, to a litigant, to an attorney. And then when we get into the case, we realize it is a service, it is an opinion that we can't give. I'm going to give you a really short view of a case that I had several years ago, and then I'm going to describe one where, as relates to another expert, it totally blew up in the guy's face. I was contacted by a CPA who was looking for someone who could give an opinion that he complied with professional standards in the performance of one of his services. And he gave me the fact pattern, and it all made sense. And he said, I only have 2 documents here. There are only 2 documents relating to my project. And they're very straightforward documents. And he sent them over to me, and I looked at them, and I realized from what I saw, it appeared that if I subjected his work to a standards test, that it would fall within the scope of professional standards and within the scope of what is appropriate within professional standards. And I shared that with the individual, and he brought me into the case. And it didn't take very long for me to realize that instead of only 2 sheets of paper, there was a whole stack of evidence, a huge stack of evidence that all of it taken together indicated that there was a clear departure from professional standards. And when it came time for me to offer my opinion, to render my opinion and put it in writing, I had to share with him and with his attorney that the evidence supports otherwise. Mm-hmm. And that they did not want me to offer an opinion relating to professional standards because it would not be helpful in that case. Now, another situation, I'm going to roll this back about 20 years. A CPA, this was a CPA's malpractice case. He was appointed by one of his clients to be the trustee of her living trust. Mm-hmm. She was 89 years old, and he was in his mid-40s when he took on this engagement. She said, I don't trust any of my children. You're the only one I trust. I want you to be my trustee. The guy took on the engagement. And shortly after he began serving as her trustee, several years went by, and he realized that the rate of return that the trust was earning on its investments, and all investments were made under the guidance of a qualified investment advisor, but the rate of return that this trust was earning was lower than the rate of return. It was lower than the interest rate that this CPA's accounting practice was paying on its revolving line of credit. Okay? So the rate of return that the trust was earning was lower than the trustee's interest rate on his line of credit in his accounting firm. So what he did was he went to his client and he asked her if he could loan money to his practice, and he would pay her a higher rate of return than she was earning on her investments, which was still lower than the rate of return that his firm was paying on their bank loan. To make a long story short, that his borrowing from his trustee's trust expanded. He eventually borrowed out virtually every dollar that was in the trust. This went on for a period of 10 years or so. And to make a long story short, the client, when her daughter was appointed as the trustee a number of years later, so he was removed, his daughter was appointed, and she said, "Oh my God, what did this man do to my mother?" And notwithstanding the fact that there were no economic damages, that in fact the trust made more money the way the accountant managed it. At the settlement conference, the judge walked into the meeting room, and they were trying to get the thing settled. Judge walked into the room where the accountant, trustee, and his attorney were sitting. And the judge looked at the attorney and said, there were no economic damages here. This lady was not damaged at all. But your client is guilty of felonious stupidity. The judge referred to it as felonious stupidity. And the bottom line is we bring this on ourselves. Don't do things that just don't make sense. You know what I mean? We, as CPA, those of us who are CPAs, as valuation experts, as expert witnesses, we're supposed to be, we need to embrace, as Zach Myers refers to it, unimpeachable neutrality. And look at our work, look at our opinions, look at contemplate challenges, and ask ourselves, does this constitute neutrality, or have we given someone food for challenge? Don't give them food for challenge. Be the most neutral, objective expert as you can, and you're going to have a much longer professional life.
Great. Thank you, Michael. Thank you again, Judges Platt and Judge Yates.
Thank you, Janae, and thank you to the judges and to Michael. And so true, your work always, it doesn't matter if you don't do litigation support engagement, just make sure that whatever is your deliverable is ready in case you have to go through the court to defend it. And because of that, it's so important to understand what is happening on the courts. And today we have Michael Mulder. He's going to be discussing one of the recent cases. So Michael.
Thank you, Alina. Here's me. All right, so the case we're talking about today comes out of Alaska. It is Downing versus Shoreside Petroleum, Inc. It's actually, it's a case from 2023. I had intended to do it last year, but I kept coming up with more interesting cases in the meantime, and so it kept getting pushed back. So here is Downing versus Shoreside Petroleum. Two key issues in this case. One, for those of you who do them, is lost future earnings from a personal injury. I have only occasionally gotten involved in those kinds of cases, but I know a lot of people get involved in them. And the big thing, and this sort of hits on all of us, is the concept of reasonable certainty. What is sufficient for reasonable certainty? So here's what the case is about. The plaintiff was a 60-year-old obstetrical surgeon. She actually did a lot of high-risk pregnancy work. She was qualified, as will come up later again, she was qualified in robotic surgery, real high-end surgeon. And she was rear-ended by a truck owned by a petroleum distribution company. It was a oil tank truck. In the accident, she was injured. She broke 5 ribs and had some neurological damage, caused some problems with her hands. She was out of work for a while. And she goes back to work part-time, but has problems with pain and other issues as she's at work. And so she's never able to return to a full schedule. She's kind of limited in some of the procedures she can do. And in August of 2019, she informed the facility where she had privileges, that's what the doctors call it, that she was not going to be able to do some of the more complex procedures and the robotic surgeries because of this neurological impairment. And the healthcare facility said, well, then we're going to have to conduct a competency investigation, which would question her ability to act as a doctor. And so to avoid that, she gave up her privileges at the hospital. And then the plaintiff sued the defendant because of the losses related to not being able to do the complex surgeries and the loss of privileges. And the defendant admitted liability for the accident, but challenged that the accident was the cause of her alleged injuries, and they also challenged the severity of those injuries and the amount of damages. At trial, they presented both sides presented physician experts regarding the extent and permanence of her neurological impairments. I'm not getting into that. The court discusses it a fair amount. But then in terms of economic damages, the plaintiff brought in witnesses from the medical practice who had testified about the extent of the work she used to do before the accident in both providing medical services and the time she spent running the business. And that she was no longer, following the accident, she was no longer able to do that. In terms of the reduced physician work she was doing, they hired a doctor to fill in for her because of her reduced availability, and then ultimately because she gave up privileges at the hospital, she could no longer perform any procedures there. And because they needed somebody to replace, in order to replace her, they needed somebody who was capable of doing robotic surgery. They had to pay this replacement $150,000 more per year than they would have for a regular obstetrics and gynecology specialist. They had the plaintiff brought in a vocational specialist as their expert witness. They testified, that vocational expert testified that past earnings loss was about $4 million and that future earnings loss was going to be about $1.1 million a year. The defendant proffered medical experts challenging the severity of the injuries, and then they offered a CPA expert that testified that the plaintiff's practice did not suffer a business loss. In particular, the CPA did not testify regarding, specifically disclaimed opining on earning capacity, the individual plaintiff's earning capacity. But the argument was that variations in business income that had been shown and used by the vocational expert in coming up with the damages number were a result of changing Medicaid rates and a bunch of non-recurring expenses, and that you couldn't simply compare a couple of years, the average of 2 years before the accident to what was earned the year after the accident, as shown on the Schedule C, and say, oh, this is what the loss is. And one of the things that I have seen, and I assume other people have who have done anything in the world of personal injury damage calculations, is that lawyers who go to economists and vocational experts, those experts tend to take an oversimplified view of what a business loss is. That's it. So what the defendant's expert did was it compared the revenues the business pre and post accident to show that the business earnings didn't really change as a result of the accident. So there was a failure in causation, and there was also a failure in the amount claimed. Excuse me. The trial court awarded the damages for the medical costs. I don't know that there was any real challenge to that. The trial court also awarded the $4 million in prior economic losses. But when it came to the prospective, the future earnings loss, the trial court said that even though the defendant's expert did not opine on that issue, and therefore the plaintiff's expert's testimony was unchallenged, the plaintiff's expert was not credible, presumably for the reasons that the defendant's expert had pointed out regarding the lack of specificity in the analysis. So the court found that the plaintiff's expert was too simplistic, that a change in business profits is not the same as a change in earning capacity, and that the post-accident earning capacity was just speculative, basically. So the plaintiff appealed the court's ruling on future earnings loss. So as this was an appeal from a bench trial, it's important to remember that the standard on appeal in a bench trial is limited to legal issues. It is the trial court's determination of the facts. It is the trial court's assessment of credibility. It is not the place for the appellate court to stick their nose into whether or not they agreed with those assessments of credibility. So what the appellate court pointed out the distinction between lost earning capacity and specifics of business loss. So lost earning capacity is a category of damages distinct from the actual dollar losses or lost profits. It is inherently somewhat speculative and doesn't require the same degree of specificity as a proof of loss for future wages or a lost profits calculation. And there's no fixed rule for calculating lost earning capacity. It's more of as long as there is sufficient evidence to show that there was a lost earning capacity, and there is just some evidence from which a fact finder could reach a reasonable conclusion of what that number is, then it should be allowed. Okay, still got time. So basically what the appellate court said is that once the trial court determined that the plaintiff had suffered a traumatic brain injury that significantly impaired her cognitive abilities, and that impairment was a permanent thing, then by definition it had sufficient evidence to establish a lost earning capacity. So the only question was whether or not the trial court had sufficient evidence from which it could determine a lost earning capacity. Back to and this obviously this is a state court case, and the standards in the state of Alaska may be different than the standards elsewhere. But the issue here, according to the appellate court, was that the plaintiff had met the standard for finding that there was reasonable certainty that there was a lost earning capacity. There was the injury and there was a reduction in earnings, personal reduction in earnings, because she couldn't do all the work she'd been doing before. And once that hurdle has established, that is the reasonable certainty aspect. There was reasonable certainty of the fact of injury and the fact of a loss. And so they only needed to establish some evidence, some data that would enable the trier of fact to reasonably estimate the amount of those damages. So that reasonable certainty was already handled by establishing the injury, establishing the loss. Basically, the appellate court sent it back to the trial court to do a calculation of what that lost earning capacity was, based on the evidence that the plaintiff had provided. And that was, hang on a minute, let me go back a bit. Sorry about that. So the thing that you want to take away from this case is that there's a substantive difference between a determination of lost earning capacity and that of actual lost earnings or actual lost profits. So lost earnings or lost profits are more driven by a specific period of time. Lost earning capacity is back to, for those of you who've done these kinds of cases in the commercial context, a lost earning capacity is more of a lost business value from the defendant's actions, as opposed to a lost profits, which is a specific period of time over which you have lost profits. And then the primary focus on a lost earning capacity case is the fact of the injury, the fact of the damage. And as soon as you have established that you've met your reasonable certainty requirement, and it's up to the jury or the fact finder to infer some amount of damages based on the information provided, the evidence provided. The case, if you're interested in reading it, is available through the key value data federal and state law database, or you can reach out to me. It's fine. I have no problem sending you a copy of it if you don't have access to KVD. And with that, I'm returning it, I guess, to Alina.
Yes. Thank you, Michael, for your time today. And now we are going to our last session of this month's show, and we have our friends from Hinge. We have Will Casserly and Austin McNair, and they are going to be talking about overcoming digital visibility challenges. So, Will, thank you for being with us.
Oh, thanks very much, Alina. I'll have to apologize. Our friend Austin was called away today with a family issue, but he sends his best. And is available for us at any point if we want to reach out. Austin is an excellent marketing resource. So today, we wanted to talk a little bit about overcoming digital visibility challenges and why this is important and why this matters. There's some sort of new shifts going on very recently, and things that are going to continue in the near term and the long term that firms are going to need to become increasingly aware of. And so today's just a little snapshot of some of the things that are going on and what's relevant, what we're seeing, drawing back from research, and kind of what some of those high points are. You know, we hear a lot about artificial intelligence and where that's going to, apply. There's I think a dominant feeling among CEOs, CFOs, and the like that AI is a very important topic, but people are still trying to really get down to the root of how it's going to apply in different ways. In the terms of marketing, it is influencing the development of content, of information. When we look at content marketing, one of the concerns is around that is it's making it a lot easier for everybody to create content, the good, the bad, and the in-between. So what's happening here is that prospective buyers ultimately are getting inundated in every single direction. And it's becoming a lot harder to distinguish, what's the best, what's the worst, and who are the best, the top providers of quality service. Like, who are they? When we think about this, there's some other things going on in the background as well. Visibility from organic search engine traffic, right? Which is how a lot of firms produce visibility, or one of the ways they do. It's changing. It's getting more difficult. Google is keeping users captive on site at a higher degree versus sending them off-site over to your website, for instance. So a lot of firms are noticing this. They're noticing a reduction in organic search traffic. And the question is, what are the best ways, or what are some options moving forward to be able to combat that? There's one example is just this month, Google is now officially testing what they call Google AI overview ads. So you notice when you type something into Google now, you may get a response, and at the top of that may be a little breakout call out box for the AI overview, how AI might respond to that question. And just below that, you're now seeing advertisements. So again, there's a whole lot of things changing in the Google algorithm, in the Google search engine results pages, those SERP pages. And those things are going to continue to evolve. And it's going to do it in a very subtle way. You might not notice those things are changing. They might introduce very small, subtle things over time as they increase, but they're definitely changing the way information is presented, the way people are consuming that, and ultimately kind of where that traffic is being steered around. Also, one other thing to notice is that social media platforms, LinkedIn, for example, are changing their algorithms as well. Some are penalizing users for supplying links inside their content, or links that might be driving users away from LinkedIn over to other websites. So again, little changes in things that we just need to be aware of in the marketing world, and how to adapt and react to those things. One of the best ways to do that, how do we proceed? How do we continue to grow visibility for firms? We always rely on research. What does the research show? So here are a few insights from Hinge's annual high growth study. When we look at utilization of marketing techniques, which firms, high growth firms that are producing a steady 20% year over year average growth, how are they implementing different marketing techniques? So what are the fastest growing and the most profitable firms doing a little bit differently? One of those things is networking on social media takes a priority. Another is networking at conferences and trade shows. It's a little bit on the rise again after a pause during COVID. And also speaking at conferences. So really sharing your insights and expertise directly with your audience. The question comes, okay, if people are engaging in those activities, exactly what are they doing inside of that? Some of the things that we understand is a lot of firms are training their subject matter experts. They're getting a little bit more serious about how they implement on LinkedIn and social media, so that everybody has a greater awareness of what works and what doesn't. They're also looking to extend that, not just with the subject matter experts, but across the entire organization. How can they leverage that strength? And really teaching people a little bit more about the nuances of liking versus commenting versus reposting. All of these things influence the algorithm. So if we're going to gain visibility online, if we're going to use LinkedIn as a tool to build business up ultimately and drive new prospective clients to our services, we should have a greater understanding of how to do that as an organization. So there's also other things going on in the background. LinkedIn is scoring things differently. It's different if you post something from your personal profile versus the corporate profile. And how and why that matters, LinkedIn has changed its mind. It used to put a little bit more priority towards corporate profiles, and lately it's putting a greater priority towards individuals, trying to force that with the understanding that people connect better at an individual level, and there's more activity around that. The other thing that is going to help influence things in a positive direction is really the quality of information and the length of the information and the format of the information as well. So while some things have become easier with AI, generating blog posts, for instance, especially short form blog posts, 750 words or less. It's a little harder to generate a long form content piece of information. It's a little harder to build out 1,500 words. It's a little harder to produce video content. It's a little harder to create infographics or provide research results, which AI can't do in the same fashion or as easily. So looking to that, frequency also matters when you publish, the consistency. So again, go back to the rules of it's quantity, it's consistency, and quality of information that all kind of help drive that visibility and separate you from the noise that's going on. And then, when we think about networking at events, we always look at trying to come up with a strategy. We're not just going to an event and hoping things turn out well, that we're really being very intentful about going to each event, who's going, how they're getting there, how things are promoted beforehand, how we're connecting with the other people who are going to be there prior to the event and during the event. And most neglected, as pointed out in this, is what happens after the event. Do we have a debrief with the team? How did it go? Are we making sure all the leads got in the CRM? Are we taking any lists that we have of attendees and reaching out to them? How are we following up? Are we simply remembering to thank the host of the event and the other presenters and the coordinators? And making sure that we're using that as an opportunity online in social media to really talk about it, right? Are we posting insights? Here's an event I went to that's very industry specific. Here's some key takeaways. If you didn't get to go, here are some of the learnings from that. So all good opportunities to be able to have content to be able to share on social media. And additionally, some of the things that comes out in the research are things around high growth firms really value research. It's the second most impactful marketing technique. Likely its value is original material to be able to uniquely market your firm, right? Email and automation is also on the rise. High growth firms twice as likely to utilize marketing automation software, as well as webinars and video content. High growth firms twice as likely to conduct original webinars and produce additional video content. The one thing that also needs to note as well is we're entering a bit of an age where able to adjust for the erosion, a little bit of erosion of organic search engine traffic. We're looking at these things. We're looking at social to shore things up. We're looking at long form content. One of the other things we're looking at is perhaps a more of demand for paid advertising. Maybe perhaps in small amounts. I'm not saying to go break the bank on it by any means, but we may need to supplement organic traffic with a little bit of paid traffic to keep our visibility levels up to where a firm is going to want or expect them to be. So just a little forecasting for the future. Again, there's a lot of great information in the 2024 high growth study that's available. It's 50% off for NACPA members, our little PSA as well. And there's also, in addition to that, the 2025 high growth study is coming up. So we invite everyone to participate in the 2025 high growth study. And along with that, you get a free copy of the report when it comes out. And that is all I have for today. Hopefully we're right on time too. Alina?
Thank you, Will. And yes, you were right on time. So thank you everyone for being with us this month. We will see you next month, November 18, 2024. And if you're still thinking about joining us during the conference in December, just don't think it anymore. Just join us and make sure that you say hi when you are there. So see you next month. Bye-bye.